The afternoon sun beat down on Officer Mike Taylor as he drove his patrol car through the quiet neighborhoods of Pine Creek. His radio crackled to life, breaking the peaceful silence inside his vehicle. Unit 14, we have a disturbance call at 1742 Maple Street. Neighbors report shouting and unusual activity. Please respond. Mike sighed and reached for his radio. Copy that. Unit 14 responding. After 15 years on the force, disturbance calls had become routine. Usually, it was just neighbors arguing over property lines or teenagers playing music too loud. But something about this call made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As he turned onto Maple Street, Mike noticed how unusually quiet the neighborhood seemed. Most Sunday afternoons, kids would be playing in front yards, and folks would be washing cars or grilling. Today, the street was empty except for a few people watching from their porches as his patrol car rolled by. The house at 1742 was easy to spot, a faded blue two-story with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. A rusty mailbox hung crooked by the driveway. Mike checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, adjusted his badge, and took a deep breath before stepping out of his car. Just another day on the job, he muttered to himself as he approached the front door. The wooden steps creaked under his weight. Mike could feel eyes watching him from neighboring houses. Mrs. Wilson from across the street stood on her porch, arms crossed, nodding at him as if to confirm he was in the right place. Police department, Mike called out, knocking firmly on the door. Anyone home? No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Police department, is everything okay in there? Still nothing. Mike tried the handle and was surprised when the door swung open. That wasn't a good sign. In his experience, unlocked doors in situations like this rarely led to anything positive. Hello. This is Officer Taylor with Pine Creek Police. I'm coming in to check if everyone's okay. The smell hit him first, musty and stale, like the house hadn't been aired out in months. The living room was dimly lit, with curtains drawn despite the bright day outside. Mike's hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster as he scanned the room. A coffee table was overturned. Picture frames lay shattered on the floor. The cushions from the couch were thrown across the room. Signs of a struggle, or maybe just neglect. Hello? Anyone home? Mike called out again, moving cautiously through the living room toward what appeared to be a kitchen. That's when he heard it, a faint sound coming from upstairs. Something between a moan and a whisper. Mike froze, listening intently. There it was again. Someone was definitely up there. Mike's heart raced as he approached the staircase. In all his years on the force, he'd learned to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him that whatever waited for him upstairs would not be just another routine call. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed, one careful step at a time. The sound grew clearer. Someone was struggling to breathe. Police department, I'm coming up to help, Mike announced, his voice echoing in the quiet house. At the top of the stairs, he noticed a hallway with 4 closed doors. The labored breathing seemed to come from behind the last door on the right. Mike approached slowly, preparing himself for whatever might be waiting on the other side. Little did he know that opening that door would change his life forever. Mike's hand rested on the doorknob for a moment before he turned it. The door creaked open to reveal a bedroom bathed in soft afternoon light filtering through thin curtains. The room was surprisingly neat compared to the chaos downstairs. Hello. Police department, Mike called out, stepping into the room. He spotted him immediately. An elderly man with thin white hair lay slumped against the side of the bed, one hand clutching his chest. His face was pale, lips slightly blue, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. Sir, are you okay? Mike rushed to the man's side, kneeling down beside him. He quickly pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need an ambulance at 1742 Maple Street immediately. Elderly male in distress, possible heart attack. The radio crackled with confirmation as Mike turned his attention back to the man. Help is on the way, sir. Can you tell me your name? Tom, the man whispered between breaths. Tom Jenkins. Okay, Tom. I'm Officer Taylor. Try to stay calm and breathe as best you can. Mike glanced around the room for clues about what happened. A tipped-over walker stood nearby. Several prescription bottles were scattered across the nightstand, some open with pills spilled out. A medical alert device lay on the floor, just out of Tom's reach. It looked like he'd fallen and couldn't get to his emergency button. "How long have you been like this, Tom?" Mike asked, gently helping the man into a more comfortable position. "Since morning," Tom managed. "Tried to get up, couldn't." Mike nodded, feeling a pang in his chest. This man had been suffering alone for hours. "Is there anyone I should call for you? Family? Friends?" Tom weakly shook his head. Mike looked around again, taking in more details of the room. The walls were covered with photographs, many showing a younger Tom in military uniform. Some looked like Vietnam-era photos. Medals and ribbons were displayed in a dusty shadow box on the dresser. "You served?" Mike asked, trying to keep Tom talking and conscious. Tom's eyes brightened slightly. "Marines, 68 to 70. My dad was in Vietnam too," Mike said. "Army." As he spoke, Mike's eyes were drawn to one particular photo on the bedside table. It showed two young men in uniform, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with a jungle backdrop. Something about one of the men looked strangely familiar. Mike carefully reached for the photo. "Is this you?" he asked, pointing to one of the soldiers. Tom nodded. "Me and best buddy saved my life." Mike stared at the other soldier in the photo, and suddenly his breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. He'd grown up seeing it in family albums. "Tom," Mike said slowly, his voice tight. "What was your buddy's name?" "Jack. Jack Taylor," Tom whispered. "Best man ever knew." Mike's hand trembled slightly as he set the photo down. Jack Taylor was his father's name. His dad had told stories about a fellow soldier who pulled him from a burning helicopter. Could this be the same man? Before Mike could ask more, the wail of sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood. The ambulance had arrived. "Hang in there, Tom. Help is here," Mike said, squeezing the old man's shoulder gently. As paramedics rushed in with their equipment, Mike stepped back, still reeling from the discovery. He watched them work on Tom, hooking up an oxygen mask and checking his vitals. One of the paramedics looked up at Mike. "Good thing you found him when you did, officer." A few more hours, and it might have been too late. Mike nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. What had started as a routine disturbance call had just become deeply personal. As they wheeled Tom out on a stretcher, Mike grabbed the photograph from the nightstand. "I'm coming with you," he told the paramedics, already pulling out his phone. He needed to call his dad right away. After all these years, he might have just found the man who saved his father's life. Mike sat in the back of the ambulance, his eyes fixed on Tom's weathered face. The oxygen mask fogged with each labored breath. The paramedics worked quickly, checking vital signs and starting an IV line. "BP's low but stable," one of them said. "Pulse is irregular." Mike barely heard them. His mind was racing. Could this really be the man from his father's stories? The one who had pulled his dad from that helicopter just seconds before it exploded? Growing up, Mike had heard the tale countless times, how his father would have died in that jungle if not for his brave friend. "Hang in there, Tom," Mike said, leaning forward. "We're almost at the hospital." Tom's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy blue, filled with confusion and pain. His gaze settled on Mike, and a faint spark of recognition seemed to flicker there. "You look like him," Tom whispered behind the mask. "Like Jack." Mike's throat tightened. "Jack Taylor is my father," he confirmed, holding up the photograph he'd taken from Tom's nightstand. "This is you and him, isn't it? In Vietnam." Tom tried to nod, the effort clearly taxing. "Never thought I'd see him again through his son." The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance with a jolt. The back doors swung open, and the paramedics efficiently moved Tom's stretcher out. Mike followed them inside, still clutching the photograph. "Sir, you'll need to wait here," a nurse told him as they wheeled Tom through double doors. "Are you family?" Mike hesitated. "No," but he stopped. What could he say? That this man might have saved his father's life 50 years ago. "I'm the responding officer," he finished, "and I think he knows my dad from Vietnam." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "I'll keep you updated. Waiting room is down the hall." Mike found himself alone in the sterile hospital corridor. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his father's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a coincidence? Taking a deep breath, Mike pressed call. "Hey son," his father's voice answered after 3 rings. "Bit early for our Sunday call, isn't it?" "Dad," Mike began, his voice unsteady. "Does the name Tom Jenkins mean anything to you?" The silence that followed told Mike everything he needed to know. "Where did you hear that name?" his father finally asked, his tone completely changed. "I'm at Pine Creek Memorial Hospital. Tom Jenkins is being treated in the ER right now. I found him during a call. He had your picture by his bed. Vietnam, 1969. Mike heard his father's sharp intake of breath. "Son, Tom Jenkins pulled me from that chopper. He's the reason you exist. Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know yet, Dad. But I think you should come. He's all alone." "I'm on my way," his father said without hesitation. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. After hanging up, Mike walked to the waiting room and sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair. He stared at the photograph in his hands. 2 young men, barely older than boys really, with their whole lives ahead of them. One would go home and raise a family. The other would apparently end up alone in a neglected house, with no one to help him when he fell. "Officer Taylor." A doctor in blue scrubs approached. "Mr. Jenkins is asking for you." Mike followed the doctor to a curtained area where Tom lay connected to various machines. His color looked better, and he'd been cleaned up. The oxygen mask had been replaced with a nasal cannula. "He's stabilized," the doctor explained. "Appears to be congestive heart failure combined with dehydration. Has he been living alone?" Mike nodded. "I think so." The house was in pretty bad shape. "That explains a lot. He's malnourished and hasn't been taking his medications properly. We'll need to address his living situation before discharge." When the doctor left, Mike pulled a chair close to Tom's bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Tom said, his voice still weak but clearer. "You called me by name in the house. How'd you know who I was?" Mike smiled. "I didn't, not at first. But I saw the photo and thought you looked familiar. My dad told me stories about Vietnam my whole life. About the man who saved him. Tom Jenkins." Tom's eyes filled with tears. "Jack, is he still?" "He's alive and well," Mike assured him. "And he's on his way here right now." Tom turned his head away, but not before Mike saw a tear slide down his weathered cheek. 50 years, Tom whispered. "Never thought I'd see him again." Mike gently placed the photograph on Tom's blanket-covered lap. "Looks like today's full of surprises for both of us." As they waited for Jack to arrive, Mike realized this was far more than a routine call. Sometimes the job put you exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. And today, that meant bringing together 2 old friends who had once saved each other's lives in ways they probably never fully understood. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Mike paced back and forth, checking his watch every few minutes. It had been 35 minutes since he called his father. The doctors had taken Tom for some additional tests, promising to bring him back to the room soon. Mike couldn't sit still. His mind was filled with fragments of stories his father had shared over the years. The helicopter crash, the jungle fire, the weeks spent recovering in a field hospital. His father rarely spoke about the horrors of war, but he always spoke about the brothers he'd made there, especially Tom Jenkins, the man who'd risked everything to save him. "Mike." A familiar voice called from the end of the hallway. Mike turned to see his father hurrying toward him. Jack Taylor had aged well for his 70s, still standing straight, with a full head of gray hair and the same determined walk he'd always had. But today, his face was pale with worry. "Dad," Mike said, meeting him halfway. They embraced briefly before Mike pulled back. "They're running some tests on Tom. They said he should be back soon." Jack nodded, his eyes moving anxiously between Mike and the hospital room doors. "How bad is it?" "Heart failure, dehydration, malnutrition. He's been living alone, not taking care of himself." Mike hesitated. "Dad, his house is a mess." "I don't think he has anyone." Jack's face fell. After all these years, he shook his head. "We lost touch in the 80s. I tried finding him a few times, but he seemed to have disappeared." Before Mike could respond, a nurse appeared, wheeling Tom back into the room. Jack froze at the sight of his old friend. Tom looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, nothing like the strong young Marine from the photograph. "Tom?" Jack's voice cracked as he stepped forward. Tom's eyes widened. For a moment, he just stared at Jack as if seeing a ghost. Then his weathered face broke into a smile that erased decades of hardship. "Jack Taylor," Tom whispered, "still ugly as ever." The tension broke as both men laughed. Jack moved to Tom's bedside and, after a moment of hesitation, reached out to clasp his friend's hand. "You look like hell, Jenkins," Jack said softly, blinking back tears. "Says the old man," Tom replied. Mike stepped back, giving them space. The nurse smiled at the reunion as she checked Tom's monitors and quietly left the room. "Your boy found me," Tom said, gesturing toward Mike. "Looks just like you," same stubborn jaw. Jack turned to Mike, pride shining in his eyes. "My son's a good cop. Always in the right place at the right time." "Like father, like son," Tom said. The three men talked for nearly an hour. Old stories flowed between Jack and Tom, some Mike had heard before, many he hadn't. The bond between the two veterans was immediately apparent, as if the decades apart had never happened. "What happened to you, Tom?" Jack finally asked. "After you left the service." Tom's smile faded. "Tried a few things. Nothing stuck. Moved around a lot. Had a wife for a while, but she couldn't handle the nightmares." He shrugged. "You know how it goes." Jack nodded solemnly. "I had the nightmares too. Still do sometimes." "Difference was you had someone to wake up to," Tom said, not unkindly. "Makes all the difference in the world." The room fell silent. Mike watched his father's face, seeing the guilt wash over it. "I should have looked harder for you," Jack said quietly. Tom shook his head. "Don't start that. We all made our choices." He glanced at Mike. "You raised a good kid. That's what matters." The doctor returned then, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jenkins, we'd like to keep you overnight for observation." Tom nodded, looking resigned. "And then what? Back to my house?" The doctor hesitated. "Given your condition, we don't recommend you living alone without support. Is there family who can help?" Before Tom could answer, Jack stepped forward. "He's got family. He's got us." The surprised look on Tom's face mirrored what Mike was feeling. His father had always been generous, but taking in an old war buddy was a big step. "Dad," Mike started, but Jack held up a hand. "Tom saved my life," Jack said firmly. "If not for him, I wouldn't have come home, wouldn't have met your mother, wouldn't have had you. We've got the spare room. It's the least we can do." Tom stared at Jack, speechless for a moment. "You don't owe me anything, Jack." "It's not about owing," Jack replied. "It's about not leaving a man behind. We made that promise 50 years ago, didn't we?" Tom's eyes glistened. He looked away, composed himself, then looked back at Jack. "Your wife might have something to say about that." Jack laughed. "Linda's been hearing stories about you for 40 years. She'll probably make you her famous pot roast the first night." Mike watched the exchange with a growing lump in his throat. What had started as a routine disturbance call was turning into something that would change all their lives. The doctor smiled. "I'll need to review home care instructions with someone before discharge tomorrow." "I'll be here," Jack said without hesitation. As the doctor left, Mike caught his father's eye and nodded his approval. Some debts could never truly be repaid, but family, whether by blood or by choice, was about being there when it mattered most. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting long shadows across Tom's bed. Mike had gone home late the previous night, but his father had stayed, refusing to leave his old friend's side. When Mike entered the room at 9 o'clock, he found the two men playing cards on Tom's food tray, arguing good-naturedly about who had cheated more during their time in Vietnam. "Your dad claims I owe him $50 from a poker game in '69, Tom said, noticing Mike in the doorway. Convenient that he remembers that, but forgets the 100 he borrowed 3 weeks later. Jack grinned, looking more relaxed than Mike had seen him in years. Memory's a funny thing, isn't it? Mike leaned against the doorframe watching them. His father looked younger somehow, energized by the reunion. Tom, too, seemed transformed from the desperate man Mike had found collapsed on his bedroom floor. There was color in his cheeks and a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dad, did you even go home last night?" Mike asked. Jack shook his head. "Couldn't leave this old troublemaker alone. The nurses brought me a cot." "He snores worse than he did in the jungle," Tom complained, but his smile gave him away. The doctor arrived then, clipboard in hand. "Good news, Mr. Jenkins. Your tests are looking better. We'll need to adjust your medications, but I think we can discharge you this afternoon. Have you made arrangements for your care?" Before Tom could answer, Jack spoke up. "He's coming home with me. We've got everything set up." Mike raised an eyebrow at his father. "We do." "I called your mother last night," Jack explained. "She's been cleaning the guest room all morning, and your brother is bringing over that extra recliner from his garage." Tom looked down at his hands. "Jack, I can't impose on your family like that." "It's not an imposition," Jack said firmly, "and it's not up for debate. You're coming home with me until you're back on your feet. Then we'll figure out next steps." The doctor smiled. "Sounds like you're in good hands, Mr. Jenkins. I'll have the nurse go over your discharge instructions and medications. You should be ready to leave around 2. After the doctor left, Mike pulled his father aside. "Dad, are you sure about this? Tom needs a lot of care right now." Jack's expression grew serious. "You know what your grandfather used to say? The measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy, but what he does when it's hard." Tom didn't hesitate when that helicopter was burning. He didn't calculate the risk or worry about the inconvenience. He just acted. Jack glanced over at Tom, who was flipping through TV channels. 50 years later, it's my turn to act without hesitation. Mike nodded, understanding. "I'll help however I can." "I know you will, son." Jack squeezed Mike's shoulder. "Now I need you to do me a favor. Tom's going to need clothes and some personal items. Could you go to his house and pack a bag?" "Sure thing," Mike agreed. "I'm off duty today anyway. What else does he need?" Jack thought for a moment. "His medications, toiletries, comfortable clothes, and look for any important documents, ID, insurance cards, military papers. Oh, and that photo album I saw on his nightstand, the one with our unit photos." "Got it." Mike turned to leave, then paused. "Dad, I'm really proud of what you're doing." Jack smiled, a little embarrassed by the praise, just doing what he would have done for me. Mike drove to Tom's house, thinking about how quickly life could change. 3 days ago, his father and Tom were strangers separated by decades and distance. Now they were picking up their friendship as if no time had passed at all. The house looked different in daylight, smaller, sadder somehow. Mike unlocked the door with the key Tom had given him and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as he'd left it, furniture overturned and picture frames shattered. Evidence of Tom's struggle before the fall. Mike moved through the house methodically, cleaning as he went. He picked up the fallen furniture, swept broken glass, and straightened picture frames. In the kitchen, he found expired food in the refrigerator and empty cabinets. It was clear Tom had been struggling for a long time. Upstairs, Mike packed a suitcase with clothes, toiletries, and medications. He found Tom's military discharge papers in a drawer, along with medals in a dusty shadow box. As he carefully placed the Vietnam photo album in the suitcase, a loose photograph slipped out. It showed his father and Tom, much older, maybe from the 1980s. They stood in front of a fishing boat, holding up an impressive catch between them. On the back was written, "Jack and Tom, Lake Michigan, 1982. Last good day." Mike stared at the image, wondering what had happened after this last good day that had separated these two friends for so many years. Whatever it was, it seemed like they were finally getting a chance to make it right. As he zipped up the suitcase and prepared to leave, Mike took one last look around the lonely house. A disturbance call had led him here 3 days ago, but something much more powerful would be leading Tom out, the unbreakable bond between two men who had faced death together and refused to let each other go. Mike's car rolled to a stop in front of his childhood home. The 2-story brick house looked warm and welcoming with smoke curling from the chimney and lights glowing in the windows. Fall decorations adorned the porch, and the smell of home cooking drifted through the air when he opened the car door. "This is it," Mike said, turning to Tom in the passenger seat. "Ready to meet the rest of the family?" Tom nodded, though his hands fidgeted nervously with the zipper of his jacket. Jack had gone ahead to prepare everyone while Mike had picked up Tom from the hospital. "Your dad says your mom is a good cook," Tom said, attempting a smile. "The best," Mike confirmed. "And she's been cooking all day for you. Fair warning, she'll try to fatten you up." They made their way slowly up the walkway, Tom leaning on a new walker the hospital had provided. Despite his protests that he could manage on his own, Mike stayed close, ready to offer support if needed. Before they reached the steps, the front door swung open. Linda Taylor stood there, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman with silver-streaked dark hair and the same kind eyes Mike had inherited. "You must be Tom," she said warmly. "Jack's told me so much about you over the years. Welcome to our home." Tom straightened his shoulders, as if preparing to meet a commanding officer. "Ma'am, I can't thank you enough for opening your home to me. I promise I won't be a burden." Linda waved away his concerns. "Nonsense. Any man who saved my husband's life is family, not a burden. Now come inside before you catch cold." The house was exactly as Mike remembered from his childhood, comfortable, lived in, full of family photos and mementos. But now there were new additions. A hospital bed had been set up in the downstairs guest room, with safety rails installed in the adjoining bathroom. "Your brother brought these over," Jack explained, noticing Mike's surprised expression. "He knows a guy who works for a medical supply company." Mike's younger brother Dave was there too, along with his wife and their teenage son. The house was full of life and warmth, so different from the cold, empty place where Tom had been slowly fading away. "Dinner's almost ready," Linda announced. "Tom, would you like to rest first, or are you up for joining us at the table?" "I've been resting in that hospital for days," Tom replied. "I'd much rather sit at a table with real people and real food." Dinner was a lively affair. At first, Tom was quiet, seemingly overwhelmed by the family chatter around him. But then Dave asked about Vietnam, and Jack and Tom began sharing stories, the funny ones, suitable for family ears. Soon everyone was laughing as the two old friends tried to outdo each other with tales of their youthful misadventures. "Remember that time we borrowed the captain's jeep?" Jack said, grinning. Tom chuckled. "And got stuck in the mud 5 miles from base? How could I forget? We pushed that thing for hours." "And still got caught," Jack added. "Worth it though," Tom said, his eyes twinkling. The look on his face when we rolled in covered head to toe in mud. Mike watched the easy way they fell back into their friendship. Something had been weighing on his mind since he found the photograph at Tom's house. "I found a picture of you two fishing," Mike said during a lull in conversation. "From 1982. It said, 'Last good day' on the back. What happened after that?" The table fell silent. Jack and Tom exchanged a look that contained decades of unspoken history. "Life happened," Jack finally said. "I got promoted at work, moved the family to Chicago for a few years." Tom had his own path. But Tom shook his head slowly. "That's not the whole truth, and you know it." He turned to the others at the table. "We had a falling out over something stupid that seemed important at the time. I said some things I shouldn't have," Jack admitted, "about choices Tom was making. And I was too proud to listen," Tom added. "Too stubborn to admit you might be right. So I walked away. Changed my number. Moved around so much that even if you wanted to find me, you couldn't." Linda reached across the table and placed her hand over Tom's. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." Later that evening, after the younger members of the family had gone home, Mike found himself sitting on the back porch with his father and Tom. The night was cool, stars shining brightly overhead. None of them spoke for a long time, content to simply exist in each other's company. "Your boy saved my life," Tom finally said to Jack. "Just like his old man, always showing up exactly when needed." Jack nodded, his eyes glistening in the porch light. "That's what Taylors do, isn't it, Mike? We show up." Mike thought about the disturbance call that had led him to Tom's house. How close they had come to never finding the connection. How a routine day on the job had turned into something life-changing for all of them. "Some things are just meant to be," Mike said quietly. "Maybe it took 50 years, but some circles need to be completed." Tom nodded, gazing up at the stars. "Better late than never, right?" As the night deepened around them, 3 generations of healing began, for the men who had faced war together, for the family welcoming a wounded soul home, and for Mike, who was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important police work had nothing to do with badges or uniforms at all. 6 months passed like the turning of seasons. Winter melted into spring, and spring blossomed into summer. Tom's health improved steadily under Linda's watchful care and home cooking. The frail man Mike had found collapsed on his bedroom floor had been replaced by someone who stood straighter, laughed easier, and had gained back 20 much-needed pounds. Today was special. Mike pulled up to his parents' house, his police uniform freshly pressed. He'd taken the afternoon off for this occasion. "Officer Mike," Tom greeted him from the porch swing where he sat with Mike's father. "Looking sharp today." "Thanks, Tom," Mike replied, climbing the steps. "You two ready for the big day?" Jack nodded, getting to his feet. "Been ready for weeks." Tom's been practicing his speech nonstop. "I could recite it in my sleep by now." "Just want to get it right," Tom said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. The three men piled into Mike's car and headed downtown. The community center was already filling with people when they arrived, veterans in their service caps, police officers in uniform, families with children, reporters from the local newspaper. "Quite a turnout," Jack observed, helping Tom navigate through the crowd. Mike led them to the front row, where seats had been reserved. The stage was decorated with American flags and a large banner that read "Veterans Supporting Veterans, Pine Creek Community Outreach Program." The mayor approached their seats, shaking hands. "Officer Taylor, Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Taylor, we're all set to begin in 5 minutes." "Are you ready?" Tom nodded, clutching the folded paper in his pocket that contained his speech. For a man who had faced jungle warfare, he looked surprisingly terrified at the prospect of public speaking. "You've got this," Mike assured him. "Just speak from the heart." The ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by a brief introduction from the mayor. Then it was Mike's turn to take the stage. "6 months ago," Mike began, looking out at the assembled crowd, "I responded to what seemed like a routine disturbance call. What I found changed my life forever." He recounted the story of finding Tom, discovering the connection to his father, and the reunion that followed. "That day made me realize something important," Mike continued. "Every day, veterans in our community are struggling alone. Men and women who served our country with honor are falling through the cracks. Some, like Tom, have no family to check on them. Others have family who don't understand what they've been through." Mike gestured to the back of the room, where a table was set up with brochures and sign-up sheets. "That's why we're launching the Veterans Supporting Veterans program today. It's a partnership between the Pine Creek Police Department and local veterans organizations. We're creating a network of support, buddy systems, regular check-ins, assistance with home repairs, transportation to medical appointments, and social events." The crowd applauded as Mike introduced Tom and Jack, inviting them to the stage. Jack stood tall and proud beside his friend as Tom approached the microphone. "I'm not much for speeches," Tom began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. 6 months ago, I was dying alone in my home. I'd given up. Thought nobody would miss me when I was gone." He paused, clearing his throat. "I was wrong." Tom looked at Jack and Mike. "These men reminded me that the bonds we form in service don't end when the uniform comes off. They reminded me that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them most." As Tom continued his speech, Mike scanned the audience. In the back row, he spotted Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor who had called in the disturbance that led him to Tom's house. He caught her eye and nodded his thanks. After the ceremony, people lined up to sign up as volunteers or to register veterans who needed support. The local VF Babu Hall had donated space for weekly gatherings. The police department had committed to training officers on better ways to support veterans in crisis. "You did good, son," Jack said, clapping Mike on the shoulder as they watched Tom chatting with a group of Vietnam veterans. "Real good." "I just answered a call," Mike replied modestly. "You're the one who opened your home." Jack shook his head. "You know what I've learned these past 6 months? Sometimes the most important calls we answer aren't the ones that come through a radio or phone. They're the ones that speak directly to our hearts, asking us to be better, to do more, to remember what really matters." As the summer sun began to set outside the community center windows, Mike watched Tom laugh with his new friends. The transformation was remarkable, not just in Tom's health, but in his spirit. The lost, lonely man was gone, replaced by someone with purpose and connection. What had started as a routine disturbance call had rippled outward, touching countless lives. Mike had answered many calls in his career as a police officer, but none had taught him more about true service than finding Tom Jenkins alone in that house 6 months ago. Some calls change everything. Some calls remind us what it means to be human.